Hello Quilt Show friends, Sharon Pederson back again with another tip for you, and this time we're going to play with an old favorite block called Drunkard's Path. I've always liked Drunkard's Path, but when I learned that I had to sew a concave curve to a convex curve, I thought, not a chance. So I'm going to show you an easy way to do it, but first we'll have a quick look at these two little quilts. I actually bought this quilt at a quilt show. I thought it was so sweet and I loved the colors. So this is one setting, and actually Drunkard's Path blocks often can be used in the same settings as log cabin blocks. So this is like a barn raising set, this particular one. And the black and white one, which I made many years ago, is called Solomon's Puzzle. And so this one is made with two blocks. One is a dark circle on a white square, and the other one is the reverse, of course, the white circle, or quarter circle, obviously, on a dark square. So let's learn how easy it is to do this. So we'll get these out of the way. Now, this particular block here is from our new DVD that's coming out very soon called Dorothy's Sampler. And Dorothy was a dear friend of mine who taught beginning quilters using the tried and true, sample quilt where you make one block each month until you get them all put together. And this is one of the blocks from Dorothy's Sampler. So this one has one little change from the two quilts I showed you, in that we have the red quarter circle on a white or light background and the reverse of that. But also for interest, we added one that has the green here. So it just gives it a nice little pop of color there. So let's learn how easy it is to do. So I'm going to make one with just the two colors. So I went to my stash and I found these two wonderful fabrics from Island Batik. I love working with batiks. There's no wrong side, so you don't have to worry about getting things mixed up. And so I decided that I would work with a 7-inch square. So I've cut the two squares that I'm going to work with, and the next part is quite simple, and we'll go through it step by step. Now the first thing you have to do, once you've decided how big your square is going to be, then you're going to decide how big the circle is, because we are not going to sew a quarter circle to that funny L-shaped piece. We're going to sew a circle onto a square, and we are going to applique it. So that eliminates that whole concave convex thing, right? Far too confusing. So here I've just arbitrarily chose the size of the circle using a compass, and I chose a radius of 3 inches. And then I looked at it and I thought, this is way too big. So I just scaled it down a little bit. So instead of the larger circle, I now have a radius of 2 1/4 inches, and this is totally arbitrary. You get to choose how big this is going to be in relation to the square that you've chosen. So once I've done that, then I make a freezer paper template. And those of you who have listened to some of my tips know I'm particularly fond of freezer paper templates. So the first thing I did was I cut a 7-inch square, because that's the size of the block that I've chosen to work with. And then with the same compass setting, 2 1/4 inches, I drew a circle in the middle. And I found it easy to divide it in half both ways. It just gives you some reference points. And then I very carefully cut this circle out, and I started using an X-Acto knife because I didn't want to cut in and break this. So I started it with an X-Acto knife, and then I continued with scissors. So whatever way you can manage it, you want to maintain the integrity of the circle, and you want to have the negative pattern as well. So now we've got two templates to work with. So the next step was to take 4 layers of freezer paper, trace the circle on the top layer, staple it together, and cut them out. And that gave me 4 lovely, except I seem to have lost one, 3 lovely circle templates. And then what I did was I took my fabric and found the wrong side, and I've already told you there is no wrong side, so obviously my little joke, right? So I took my fabric I took it to the ironing board. I put my circle template on this fabric, making sure that I had at least 1/4 of an inch around that outside edge because you need a seam allowance. And I cut it out, okay? Iron it to the wrong side, cut it out, leaving between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So that produced this. Here I have my lovely fabric. I've ironed the freezer paper to the wrong side, if there is a wrong side, and I've cut, leaving between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now the next step for me is to take a glue stick, and the glue stick has to be one that's repositionable. You can't use your good old glue stick because once it dries it's permanent, and then you can't get the freezer paper out. So I use Scotch brand is one, and Soline makes another one. And what you're going to do is just put a little bit of the glue stick on the fabric, and then with your favorite tool, and for some people that's their thumb, all right, you're going to turn the edge over. And so on this sample, I've already done that. So this one has the 1/4 of an inch turned under, and so now I'm ready to position it on my background fabric. So the background fabric, I'm only going to use 2 colors here, aren't I? So I've chosen the orange background square, and I've centered the circle onto the background square. Now, centering a circle can be a bit dicey, and so remember I said you want to make sure that you maintain this template, the negative image template, and remember it's also a 7-inch square, isn't it? So all I did to make sure that my circle of darker fabric is in exactly the right spot was I put the negative image template on top of that square of fabric, and of course then my circle fits perfectly in the middle. And you can see I've got Scotch tape or tape holding it down. I don't use pins when I'm doing this type of applique because if you put a pin through freezer paper, it moves. Now on a big thing like this, it's pretty easy to control that. But what if you were doing a little tiny circle or a small leaf or something? Then pins just aren't going to do it. So I've got it taped in place, and now I take it to my sewing machine. Now my favorite applique stitch is a very narrow zigzag. And for you to be able to see it, I'm going to turn this over because you're looking at the right side. And I like to do invisible machine applique, so clearly you're not going to be able to see it on this side, are you? So let's turn it over and you'll see, because I used an orange bobbin thread. Now, on my machine, the width of the zigzag stitch that I use is 0.5. So it's literally barely moving from left to right. The length is about 2.5. So when you turn your sewing machine on and choose a zigzag stitch, you're going to change both the width and the length of that stitch to get it to look like this. And it's always a good idea to do a test on a little scrap, isn't it? So test your stitch length, test the width, and of course stitch quality. Make sure you can't see any bobbin thread on the top. Now, a lot of people tend to match their bobbin thread to their background fabric, but in fact, if it's going to be a problem and I'm going to show someplace, it's going to be on the applique, isn't it? So I match my bobbin thread to my applique. So remember, orange thread down here. And then if I did have any tension problems, which I didn't, but just in case, I always use bobbin thread to match my applique. So I start by anchoring my stitches, and I usually start either at the 12, 3, 6, or 9 o'clock positions here, and I anchor my stitches. When the needle is going to the right, after you've switched to your zigzag, the needle will be in this dark fabric. When it's to the left, it's going to be just catching the very edge of that. So zoom around the whole thing, and when you have finished stitching, again I anchor my stitches by doing tiny, tiny little straight stitches. So let's have a look at the back of this. You've seen the front, all nicely sewn down, but we have to get rid of our freezer paper. So what I do is I cut 1/4 of an inch inside that stitching line, and that orange thread is nice here too because you can see it against that dark background. So 1/4 of an inch, remove that background fabric, and of course that gives you access to the freezer paper, and you gently pull the freezer paper out. Now this is where you find out that you can't use an ordinary glue stick, because if you did, the freezer paper would stay underneath that seam allowance and you'd have a kind of crinkly quilt, you know, crinkle, crinkle, crinkle. Okay, not a good idea. So repositionable glue stick is your best bet, or you could use rubber cement as well. Now, once you have it all sewn down, we are obviously, you've already spotted this, you're going to cut your square with a circle applique. You're going to cut it in 4. Now again, measuring and finding the center of this is a pain in the neck. So what did I do? I've lost my ruler. Where did I put it? There it is. Oh boy, put it down and somebody puts a quilt block on top of it. Now, you can see that I have taken one of those freezer paper images, one of those templates, and folded it in half, and I positioned it on the back of my ruler and I taped it in place. And you'll also notice that it is very clearly at the 7-inch, okay, the 7-inch marking, and in this side it's in 3.5 inches. So instead of fooling around with every block trying to find the middle, all you have to do is line this up with the top of your square, all right, and your little circle is then perfectly in the center, and you would cut once, all right, then carefully lift your ruler, reposition it this way. Again, you've got lots of things to line up, and again your little circle is exactly in the middle, and cut with your rotary cutter again, and of course that is going to produce 2, 4 Drunkard's Path units from each of those squares. Wonderful, isn't it? So then you get to design with them, and as I mentioned earlier, you can use many of the settings that you use for a log cabin, for instance, but just play with them for a while and you'll probably find you'll come up with something interesting. Now, 2 little troubleshooting things that we have to pay attention to, and one of them is what happens if you have not enough fabric to cut a 7-inch square, or what if you don't have enough fabric to cut the circle that's going to go in there, but you're 1 block short and you desperately have to make it? What if you have enough fabric to do your circle in 2 pieces instead of in 1? You know, this isn't going to work for that, is it? But can you see that it would work extremely well if you did it this way? Okay, now all you need is 1/4 of an inch seam allowance there and there, and enough of a seam allowance here to provide a seam allowance for both of those half circles. So there you've achieved the same thing, because we're going to cut this in half anyway, aren't we? So if you start with your circle in 2 pieces, you're just going to line it up so that it's either, you know, perfectly in the center here or perfectly in the center here. And the other option, of course, is what if you don't have enough fabric for the 7-inch background square? Because both of these things have happened to me, and that's how we learn a lot of these tricks, isn't it? So here I have a situation where obviously I didn't have enough of the blue fabric to cut a circle, but I had enough to cut 2 semicircles. So that's going to produce the 4 units that I need. And similarly, same thing happened here, okay? I didn't have enough of the background fabric to cut a 7-inch square, but I had 2 3.5-inch pieces that were 7 inches long. So these things, you can accommodate it by positioning it so that when you cut it in half, that's going to be the first cut. And ta-da, you can make beautiful, beautiful, beautiful Drunkard's Path blocks, and you never have to sew a concave curve to a convex one. So watch for Dorothy's sampler, because this block is included in it along with many other interesting blocks. Hope you enjoyed it.